When it comes to the rankings of US states, for decades, California has usually been at the top. Whether it's the richest, most populous, or even the most desirable. But this is all starting to change, as Texas, a state which most people associate with cattle and oil, is taking its place. In 2022, Texas welcomed 500,000 new arrivals from across the country, and California was the top source, with over 100,000 people deciding to leave the Golden State for a better life in Texas, the largest state-to-state migration flow in the entire country. And it's easy to see why people are moving. Incomes in Texas have been some of the fastest growing in the United States for the last decade, and compared to California, housing costs are 48% lower, and when it comes to the general picture of the cost of living, Texas ranks lower across nearly all factors, on the whole being around 17% cheaper. Even in Austin, Texas's most expensive city, houses are still nearly half the price as in Los Angeles. And whilst it's true, on average, salaries in Texas are lower than in California, the difference is not as significant as the cost of living gap. People are starting to notice this, and every year more and more large companies move to set up shop in one of Texas's main cities, taking advantage of the ever-growing labour pool. Since the COVID pandemic, around 140 companies have relocated their headquarters to Texas, and more than 40% of these relocated from California, with some of the biggest ones catching headlines with the likes of Oracle and Tesla. Texas is America's second largest state in landmass behind Alaska, and whilst this gap can never be closed, when it comes to the population and size of its economy, Texas is quickly narrowing the gap to take first place from California. Because for the last 20 years, Texas has been growing far quicker. Part of this is to do with jobs, as Texas ranks second in terms of employment growth in the whole country, narrowly behind Florida and Nevada, while California ranks dead last. Much of this is driven by the state's bustling metropolitan areas of Austin, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, which house over 2/3 of the state's new arrivals every year, boosting domestic demand and job supply. And aside from their rapidly growing economy and population, Texas is also of incredible strategic significance to the United States due to its massive oil reserves. It's a fossil fuel powerhouse, producing 43% of America's total oil production, more than the other leading 8 states combined, and more than most OPEC countries, and just less than the entire production of Central and South America combined. Ever since the 1970s, the value of the state has continued to rise as the US aims for energy self-sufficiency. And this has only increased recently as the world today looks even more protectionist than before, placing Texas perfectly at the center of the United States growth engine, whether it be producing semiconductor chips, oil, or tech. The Lone Star State looks like it's only going to keep growing. In the process of making these videos, there's a lot of behind the scenes work. But for anyone looking to get started out where this seems intimidating, you can check out today's sponsor, InVideo AI, the world's most used AI video creator with over 10 million users across more than 150 countries. It puts you in the driver's seat and works as your personal sidekick, being the perfect co-pilot. Just come in here and type a prompt. From there, it will create the first cut of your video, complete with everything. Want to translate to another language? No problem. You can use the text prompts to change parts of the videos you don't like.
Eso es un enorme aumento de más del 12,000%.
And you can also add your voice and ask InVideo to clone it for other projects. So if you're interested in checking it out, you can get started today for free, but I'd highly recommend choosing the paid plan that starts as low as $20 a month. What's good about this is that it will save you hundreds of dollars by combining the features of different tools all packed into one. Just click on the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on the screen and use my code to get 2 times the number of video generation credits in the first month. And now let's get back to the video. Texas joined the United States in 1845, and at the time its economy was primarily based on cotton farming and ranching, with cotton in particular being a major economic driver, as the state's vast land and warm climate made it ideal for cultivation, which was labour intensive and heavily reliant on slavery. But the Civil War devastated the economy, particularly the cotton industry. And during Reconstruction, Texas faced real difficulties. But at the turn of the century came an event which would change the state of Texas forever. On January 10, 1901, a well at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont erupted, shooting oil 150 feet into the air and producing an astounding 100,000 barrels per day. This single well produced more oil than all other wells in the US combined, and instantly put Texas at the center of the nation's emerging oil industry. Before this, Texas produced relatively little oil and gas, and crude oil production was only about 1.3% of the total US production, with natural gas being just 0.1%. But by 1952, Texas's shares of total US crude oil and natural gas production peaked at 45 and 52% respectively. The oil boom led to rapid population growth and urbanization. Beaumont's population exploded from about 10,000 to 50,000 in just a few months, and Houston transformed from a small commercial center into one of the largest cities in the United States in just a few decades. After World War II, the state again saw massive growth, driven by America's rapid industrialization as the demand for petrochemical products continued to increase. The state also became a key player in the national defense industry, with numerous military bases appearing across the state and substantial investments in infrastructure, including highways and airports, which facilitated trade and commerce. By the 1980s, oil in Texas looked unstoppable. Oil prices had just skyrocketed, reaching $37 per barrel by 1981, nearly a tenfold increase from 1973. This brought in massive revenues and benefited Texas enormously, adding to the growth in cities like Houston. But these heady days came tumbling down when oil prices began to fall in 1980, dropping by more than half in 1986 alone. Oil and gas accounted for nearly 20% of the state's economy, and the oil bust led to a severe economic recession. Within a year of the price drop, over 50,000 of Texas's workers lost their jobs, with another 50,000 jobs disappearing in the aftermath. And in Houston, this meant that around 1 in 8 people lost their job. Texas was hurt, but they knew one thing: they had to diversify their economy. And for the last 40 years, this has been one of the #1 priorities for the state, and is why we are suddenly seeing it make such a rapid rise. Since the 1980s, Texas has been emerging as a top destination for professional services firms, meaning the state has successfully kicked the trend of employment being directly linked to oil prices, and since the 2000s, this has started to move away. So much so that in 2014, when oil prices tumbled again, despite being a top exporter, Texas came out relatively unscathed, as the financial and business services sectors were no longer primarily serving oil and gas companies. Their clients also now included technology firms, defense contractors, and large renewable energy businesses. And in the last decade since 2014, the trend of companies, especially in tech, relocating to the Lone Star State has completely exploded. Today, the tech industry accounts for roughly 20% of Texas's entire GDP, pretty much matching the impact of the oil industry and contributing $470 billion in 2022 alone. It's also estimated that jobs in tech will grow twice as fast as the overall US workforce over the next decade, putting Texas in a uniquely advantageous position to lead the charge into a future defined by technological advancements. And after COVID, things picked up pace even quicker. Since 2020, over 140 different companies have moved their operations to Texas, with over half coming from California. This is for a few different reasons. Firstly, Texas is one of only 6 states to not levy any corporate income tax. And even though they still need to pay for things like franchise and sales tax, this is a stark contrast to the more expensive and far more restrictive regulations in place in states like California, where most of the big movers originated from. This sort of stuff doesn't go unnoticed. Tesla moved from Palo Alto, California to Austin in 2021, committing to a $770 million factory expansion that is set for their gigafactory in the city. HP also saw a move in 2022, and even Apple, which was falsely reported as moving its HQ to Austin, is still expanding its campus, which is expected to cost around $250 million. Even as many established companies start afresh in the state, it still remains a very promising place to start a new business. Aside from seeing a higher demand for services, new businesses have very simple state regulations to comply with. Manufacturers in particular get a lot of tax exemptions for sales, and in general, new businesses can expect property tax breaks, no franchise tax, and very low corporate tax rates. With substantial control and influence over the oil industry and tech sector, Texas is already incredibly powerful. But what is adding to its rise is the rapid influx of people who are moving to the state every year. It's no secret that as a place gets more people, it becomes more powerful. People start families, buy homes, support local businesses, pay taxes, and overall contribute to Texas's economy. And as more and more companies move to Texas, it's feeding a virtuous cycle that is bringing people from all around the country, but especially California. In the past, California was the most attractive destination to move in America, and it stayed this way until relatively recently. Even though it was always relatively more expensive, it had some of the best employment opportunities in the world, at large tech firms like Meta or Google, or even in the past at HP or Apple. But today that is changing, and combined with a list of problems which covers everything between rising costs to rising levels of homelessness, people are more than ever looking for a reason to leave the Golden State. Especially as housing has now become unaffordable for the vast majority of people living in California's major cities. The median listing price for a home in San Diego was $925,000, $1.1 million in Los Angeles, $1.25 million in San Jose, and $1.3 million in San Francisco. But in Texas's major cities, the same data from the same source in the same time shows a median listing price for a home in Houston as just $340,000, $430,000 in Dallas, and even in Austin, this is only $620,000, meaning that home prices in Houston and Fort Worth are generally around 4 times less than in San Francisco. Dallas-Fort Worth is likely all set to surpass Greater Chicago as America's third largest metropolitan area within only a decade from now, at which point it will remain only behind LA and New York. But DFW is far from the only urban area in Texas which has been booming with people. Recently, millions have moved to the state's other major cities in Houston, San Antonio, and Texas, in an emerging densely populated mega-region that has been called the Texas Triangle. The Triangle only takes up less than a quarter of Texas's total land area and is roughly comparable in size to the state of Georgia, and yet it already contains a population of more than 22 million people, or about 3/4 of the state's entire population. Having most of your population and GDP concentrated in a small area has a number of significant advantages. Firstly, having the Texas Triangle's major cities closely connected is really good for the state's growth. Efficient transportation infrastructure allows frequent, low-cost interactions between people, businesses, and institutions, which increases innovation and boosts productivity. Better connectivity also brings businesses access to a larger talent pool, and workers find more job opportunities, creating a dynamic and thriving labour market. As these cities grow, they can attract more businesses and talent, benefiting from economies of scale and increasing overall economic output. The Triangle also sits at roughly the center point of the contiguous 48 United States, enabling easy and rapid air travel to both American coasts and to Latin America. And since 2021, DFW has ranked as the second busiest airport in the entire world by passenger traffic. And underpinning their rapidly growing economy is of course their incredible supply of energy. In a modern economy, those who control the supply of energy are generally pretty powerful, and while we already know about Texas's immense oil reserves, what often goes unnoticed is their growing supply of renewable energy capacity. It's no secret that oil isn't renewable, and in the next few decades, more and more energy is going to be coming from renewable sources, once again placing Texas in pole position to take advantage of this trend. Texas has produced more gigawatt hours of electricity from renewable sources than any other state for several years running, thanks largely to wind energy. And the state is expanding its lead by continuing to be the country's leader in wind energy by a mile, and quickly closing the gap on California on utility-scale solar power. Texas's total from wind and solar is huge, more than either New York or Ohio generate from all electricity sources. But Texas is also the country's leader in overall electricity generation, and it's the leader in generation from gas and coal too. Meaning that while the total for wind and solar is gigantic, it only accounts for around 1/4 of total energy produced from all sources in the state. Most states tend to be known for one thing. New York's economy is driven by services, whereas Wyoming is dependent on mining. But what makes Texas so powerful, and also somewhat unique, is that its growth engine comes from a lot of different sources. It's already a leader for energy production, and is quickly taking the crown of tech giant away from California. That's not to say the state is without its problems, and issues with energy supply highlight how the state sometimes struggles to cope with its rapid growth. But this aside, there is no doubt that Texas is quickly becoming America's richest and most important state.